And there's a beautiful Gandhi quote, says, "When I despair, I remember that all through history, the way of truth and love have always won.
Mm.
There have been tyrants and murderers, and for a time they can seem invincible, but in the end, they always fall.
Yeah.
Think of it, always." That's what I think about right now, is like always. They always fall, and our job is to create the ripening conditions in which that can happen faster and sooner and more deeply and meaningfully than it might otherwise have done.
Welcome, my friends. Thank you for joining us. I am very honored here to have the opportunity to share with you some of the words and wisdom of Rivera Sun. She is an activist, an educator, wonderful author. I've personally benefited from her regular editing of nonviolence news, of the Dandelion insurrection, of wonderful lectures, and the spreading of the good word of peace activism all over the world and online. And I would be very happy to introduce you to Rivera Sun. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me on this, John. It's great to be here with you and to be speaking with your listeners.
Thank you very much. So, one of the things I like to often open with, especially in the world of peace activists, very often we feel a bit worn down by our work and the world around us. And sometimes it's really useful to have that ray of hope. And I know that often in your nonviolence news, you'll say, here's this wonderful thing that's happening. It actually works. Do you mind giving us a few of those glimmers of light?
Oh, sure. You mean from like this week alone kind of thing?
Whatever it is that
Um,
brings you the will to go, wow, this is really working.
Mm. Well, there are so many things. Nonviolence is both a set of tools for making change and also like a set of ideas or practices or solutions for our society. So the things that we are also trying to campaign for are often what I would call systemic or structural nonviolence, like nonviolent solutions. So both of those actually give me hope, whether we're talking about a victory we've achieved, a strike that's been won, a policy that's been changed, or we're talking about some milestones on the journey to achieving those goals. For example, just last week in India, 300, something like 300 million people went on strike for a day. Can you imagine? That's like the size of the entire United States went on strike altogether. The roads shut down, the schools shut down. Even people who were not um, planning to participate in the strike found themselves de facto stuck at home because the transportation wasn't running or their offices shut down because 75% of the people hadn't showed up. So it was a truly remarkable thing. And, India has organized the world's largest protests and strikes to date. So I find that kind of thing incredibly inspiring, just to see that sheer volume of people willing to stand up for their rights, in this case, wage structures and improvements, things like that.
It's fantastic. Do you have a sense of what has led to their great success, their willingness to organize, and that quality of community that is needed for this kind of movement to happen?
Well, in this particular day-long strike, there were 10 major unions who all went on strike together, representing like 150 million people. So if you can imagine, you're part of the union and your husband stays home from work, or you say to your friend, "Hey, let's not go to work today." And even though they're not in the same union as you, because you're staying out, they play hooky too. And so that very quickly, if each person in the unions brought one person along, boom, you have the numbers I was just talking about. So that's one element. I think another element is they have been doing mass organizing since the 2021 farmers' protests. There was a set of agricultural bills that the Modi government was trying to put through that were very detrimental to local farmers. And They organized again 250 million people for sustained protests in the streets. So I think much of this momentum comes off the back of that robust organizing work they'd done. And then, of course, India is the birthplace and the homeland of Gandhi, and you don't get any more great inspiration for nonviolent action than that.
Yeah, he is the center of so much inspiration for a lot of us. His birthday coming up on October 2nd. And gosh, yeah, thank you for sharing that. Mm. So these mind-bogglingly large gatherings of people coming together. And I've heard Michael Nagler report sometimes statements that all it takes is something like 3% of the population in order to make a big shift. Is there a sense of what it would take in places like, for instance, the space that you and I live in the United States to gather people together to get a sense of enough momentum? We've had some pretty large uh, group protests in this last year, which is wonderful to see, but it doesn't seem to be quite enough to get over that hump of uh, the tipping point, as they say. And I'm wondering what your sense as an activist and an educator tells you about what we need to create that momentum.
Yeah, I'm really looking at the phase that we're in as building momentum for that toward that tipping point. In the US, we tend to be fairly not disorganized, but less institutionally organized, which is a challenge when it comes to mass movements for change. That said, we have seen people really coming together to demonstrate, to oppose what's going on, to push back against authoritarianism or budget cuts or, ICE raids, whatever the set of issues is, because many people are upset about many things. We had the No Kings protests about a month ago, and we saw between 4 and 10 million people in the streets, depending on the source that you heard on that. I think it was somewhere around 10 million, honestly, which is enormous. It's one of the biggest protests we've ever had on a single day. We know that 3.5% of the population is about 11 million people. So it's very close to that tipping point, and that number really describes the threshold that we've seen in empirical research on nonviolent movements. Any movement that has successfully mobilized 3.5% of the population has always won. But that's not just in a single day protest, that's in sustained acts of civil disobedience, of non-cooperation, of intervention, things like general strikes. There may be mass demonstrations going on as well, but because the people are at the mass demonstrations, they're not at work, they're not at shopping, they're not at school. Right. So this is an important thing for us to be aware of that we need to add to our great protest work to get into the part of the toolbox we call non-cooperation. And we did see an excellent sign of that just last week. No Kings and Indivisible held a mass training call for, I think, up to 130,000 people registered, attended, and watched the recording afterwards if they couldn't attend live in person. It was unbelievable. I was on the Zoom call, and it maxed out at 20,000 people. The spillover on YouTube had 20,000 viewers, Facebook another like thousands of viewers, another site had thousands of viewers live all at the same time talking about this shift, going beyond protest into things like refusing to obey the executive orders that are coming out of the Oval Office, the ones that violate human and civil rights. How to use Know Your Rights trainings to push back at ICE raids, how to defy book bans and bans on pride flags and bans on like Idaho's ban that they just passed against everyone is welcome here signs. So being able to defy even when the stakes go up a little bit. This is how we reclaim people power and really effectively push back moment by moment, policy by policy, location by location against the attempts of authoritarianism to destroy democracy, demean and belittle human beings, implement a police state or a militarized or military state, So there's much to do, but this training and this kind of work is the preparation for being able to effectively wield the kind of people with power that I see every week in nonviolence news, and scholars of this work have seen around the world over and over and over again. You would not believe how many dictators nonviolent struggles have kicked out of power in the last 50 to 70 years.
And that's really hopeful for people to hear that it's not just that we hope that it'll work someday, but that it's fantastically effective. We can track its progress. It tends to work better than military action or acts of violence, which of course is what our media tells us is the only useful way to get anything done is at the end of a gun or sharp words. And I find it really hopeful, really inspiring to hear about the work of our ancestors and the people that have come before that dedicated their whole lives to making our world just a little bit better. And every generation, the possibility for something to get a little bit better seems to grow that arc of justice. And so I appreciate so much the work that you're doing, getting the news out there, letting us know so that we're not hobbled by what shows up on most people's televisions and radios and internet feed.
Absolutely. We focus on stories in nonviolence news that have three components. They tell you about the problem, right? So you know the issue that's causing harm in our world. They tell you about the solution. What do we want instead? And they tell you about the people who are trying to make it happen, to get from A to B. And I find it's a much healthier way for us to be kind of absorbing news and information. It's focused on engaging with the conflict, finding a place of empowerment, understanding the kind of social dynamics that are happening as we try to create change. When we have a narrative on television or the news that simply goes, here's this terrible thing that's happening, uh, it reinforces our sense of powerlessness. Now, sometimes the news it's still waiting. It has to report on that and wait until we play catch up a little bit and get our act together to deal with the thing. But sometimes that's not true at all. I mean, a lot of times they're reporting on the issues without talking about, the mass strikes that are happening, the ways that people are demonstrating against it, the officials who are refusing to go along with the plan. And when you hear those stories as part of the report, your feeling state as a human being is very different reading them or listening to them.
Yeah, that's right. Gosh. And along this same arc of discussion for the people who are themselves discovering their inner activist or just the desire to help make a change in a positive direction. For instance, I know that the Metta Center for Nonviolence has some wonderful peaceful activist training systems that they go through. Do you have any particular favorite books, videos, resources that you'd recommend to people? And I'll link everything down below.
Oh, absolutely. There's a wonderful 13-minute TED Talk by the researcher Erica Chenoweth that covers that 3.5% number and also what makes nonviolent struggle so effective. It's a great TED Talk by Jamila Rakib from the Albert Einstein Institution. There's a wonderful documentary series, six-part series called A Force More Powerful, which I think everyone should watch. It covers stories like what we've been talking about from Chile, Poland, India, the US civil rights movement, and a couple of others. And it really goes into like how this stuff works and how it's been a part of resistance in history. There's a great episode on how Denmark resisted the Nazis, which I hate to say is very relevant for today.
No spoilers, no spoilers.
We are so fortunate to be confronting these times with the great wealth of knowledge available at our fingertips. The way I got into doing all this work was I was a novelist and I had posited a hidden corporate dictatorship in a slightly fictionalized United States just around the corner of today. This was the Dandelion insurrection, and it was in 2012 when I was writing it. So I got my characters into this huge mess and I did not know how to get them out of it. So I Googled it, how to bring down dictators non-violently. And I thought maybe some speculative fiction would come back. What came back were all these case studies, the Philippines kicking Marcos out of power, Chile kicking Pinochet out of power, Serbia getting rid of Milosevic, and on and on and on. And I just started reading my way through all the case studies, all the research on them, and revising my plot as I went. And what really struck me was that we are so lucky to be able to just Google it. Just Google it. Find out how to get rid of dictators nonviolently. And you will find some real gems out there in terms of getting tools and strategies for the times that we're in.
I love that. Gosh. And your voice out there amplifying all of the tools, I think is just so fundamentally helpful. And of course, for the people who haven't quite checked you out yet, I highly recommend finding your books, hopefully in your favorite local bookstore. Small bookstores are better. Children's books, books for adults, and fantasy reads, and just a lot of fun. The adventures of Charlie and Zadie Bird Gray, and very worth following.
Yeah, people can find my books on my website as well, riverasun.com. And it is a great alternative to shopping at Amazon, especially as we're trying to resist billionaire power and billionaire takeovers. Every dollar that you can redirect from a billionaire's pocket into a local artist, a local writer, a craftsperson, a local farm is yet another victory. So please enjoy that. I send handwritten notes to everyone when they get their books from me and sign them to them. So there are perks.
Aha, there are perks. All of those links down below for people who are looking. Hmm. One of the things that I had heard from a talk that you did relatively recently with Michael Nagler, and you had mentioned the the idea that within the United States, the story of the War of Independence, the Civil War, these classic stories that, they become bedtime stories for kids in the United States, that the story of the peaceful activists behind that, the most effective movements themselves, weren't the stories of the guns and the bloodshed and the things that are often told, especially to male gendered people in our culture here. And I am curious if you don't mind talking a little bit more about that and the resources that we can find, because I am uh, not ashamed, but it's something that had never even occurred to me. I'm so well conditioned by the books and the things that I've read my whole life. When you said that, it's this obvious statement, and it blew the top of my head off. And I've been talking about it nonstop since. And so I'm wondering if you can fill in a little bit more about that and resources that we could look into.
Yeah, a lot of what I would call nonviolent history is right in front of our eyes and never named that, never called that specifically. So you were not alone in that experience, John, of being like, what? I never thought of the American Revolution this way. Personally, I studied the American Revolution for 6 years in a row, growing up through a twist of moving schools and changing curriculums. And I never thought of it that way until I was all grown up and studying nonviolent struggle. But the decade that preceded the Declaration of Independence was marked with robust nonviolent struggles for change. The resistance to the Stamp Act, when people refused to buy or pay for these stamps, the refusal to pay taxes to the king because they weren't being represented, boycotting British goods was some of the world's most successful boycotts to date that we never study and never really like even get to take pride in as American people. These were just some of the many, many types of nonviolent action that preceded the Declaration of Independence. And I think that that case study in particular made me really start to like pay attention to history in a different way and say, okay, here's an act of resistance that someone is doing. And they didn't pick up a gun to do it. They didn't throw a punch to do it. This was a nonviolent action. It might not have been peaceful on the outside. It might have been raucous. It might not have been legal. It might have been an act of civil disobedience. Like the silent sentinels and the suffragists who got women the vote, they were bold, they were defiant, they broke the law, they went to jail, they had a hunger strike in jail, and refused to eat for better conditions while they're in there. So, I think carefully looking at history and paying attention to those can be very empowering because you start to see that we're not alone in wanting to make change and to make that change without the use of violence. And I think once you start to see this in history and question the narratives of history, you can also question the narratives of the stories that are being churned out by our culture all the time. We've spent the last 30 years putting trillions of dollars into like Marvel comic movies, which every single one has a very simple narrative. Violence is going to save the day, right?
Always.
I mean, you'd think we would get bored by this by at some point. In reality, our use of violence often is very costly, very painful to ourselves and others, comes with long-term consequences, doesn't necessarily resolve the underlying conflict or injustice. It just, as they say, war doesn't determine who is right and who is left, only who is left standing, right? So I am very curious about narratives. That's why I'm an author. That's why I'm an activist. That's why I collect these stories for Nonviolence News, why I tell nonviolent history, because I think we have more power than we think outside of the realms of war and violence. And I think reclaiming those stories and weaving them into the fictional narratives that we're telling, the big epic stories, the dramas, um, is a way of starting to tell myths and stories that reflect our lived reality. One of the stories that I write or series that I write is a fantasy series for young adults, which as a Taoist, you might appreciate this. So where the young girl is learning a non-martial art like Aikido, and called the Way Between, which is neither violence nor passivity. And as I've been writing that, I've really been reflecting that the series is about reclaiming the strength and the power of things like unarmed peacekeeping, violence, de-escalation, conflict resolution skills. And the non-martial art is really like a physical embodiment, something to give us this visceral sense of it. Because when you look at it, young people in this country today, far more of them have engaged in an active protest, and quite a dramatic one. Lots of our high school students have already had the experience of walking out of class over with March for Our Lives, with the Black Lives Matter, and a few other issues, including recent immigration protests, particularly in Southern California. So, oh, and also Fridays for the Future and the climate strikes. So they have already engaged in a heroic act to try to save their lives, save their friends, make a big change in our world, keep people safe, protect their communities. And they've done it with these nonviolent actions by going on strike, by walking out of school, by going and protesting, by marching. But the narratives that we're telling them as adults are saying, pick up a gun, throw a punch. That's how you be a hero. They're already heroes. Why aren't our stories honoring that? That's what my life's work is about, is really kind of helping us see the power of this and tell better stories so that we can live better stories.
You're doing it very effectively,
Thank
I
you.
think. Gosh. Yeah, and I feel, a number of the most inspired peace protesters and nonviolence actors that I've been interacting with lately, very often they are people who come from a backdrop of violence, and I include myself within that, whether it's the world of martial arts or veterans who went to war and they've suffered what doctors are recognizing now as moral injury, the damage that we've done to ourselves by becoming tools of violence. And afterward, we look back and we're suffering and we begin that healing process. And so often people will talk about they have no sense of where to go because we have no way to envision ourselves as different, at least within the culture that we grew up in. And this quality of our storytellers and the people who help to envision a better way forward, the elders in our community, for them to offer us, hey, this is a different perspective. that rather than just the science fiction stories that we hear of this dystopian future, this is this inevitable thing that's going to happen, barcodes on our forehead. Instead, I was very inspired by the solar punk movement when that came out and this idea of envisioning, wow, something possibly better, things we'd never considered before, like speaking for myself. And so many of these people that have suffered from being actors of violence, because of course we suffer as well, suddenly being able to turn around and find something that's a little bit different, no, a lot different in the case of peace activism, and the hopeful way forward, and then suddenly turning around and saying, wow, this has been going on for a long time. Look, there's a documented history, and then being able to join this movement. I just think that you're providing a fantastic bridge for so many of us. And I really appreciate your guidance, your pointers toward a better future.
Yeah, I mean, when we look at nonviolence as this big, broad toolbox, something that applies to everything like nonviolence towards yourself, where you try to take care of your body, you try to do a little meditation or centering practices, you really work on your mental health and wellness, or then there's nonviolence towards others, developing conflict skills, active listening, violence de-escalation, so that you can engage in interpersonal conflicts with your coworker, on the street, with your family, without resorting to causing harm. Nonviolence towards the world through these social movements and the solutions that we're pushing for. And of course, nonviolence towards the earth as well, because we're learning that our violence towards the earth cannot be sustained. We need to live in a nonviolent relationship there. All of this is uh, it's gives us a sense of a whole different world that's literally at our fingertips. And it's not hypothetical or speculative. It has a really great track record. Some things like restorative justice being thousands of years old in indigenous cultures. Or things like street teams and violence prevention teams having like being able to reduce homicide rates in cities all over the United States by like up to 80% in a single year. We know the solutions to violence. What we need is widespread implementation, funding for them. And the funny thing about these nonviolent solutions is that compared to our violent responses to violence, they are way more cost effective, which is the last reason we should adopt them, but is a very compelling reason for public policy makers. For example, let's look at like big conflicts in the world. We have some really embroiled conflicts. Ukraine, or Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Israel's attacks on Gaza. And our solution as a nation is to keep giving military funding to them, billions of dollars at a time. That's the only response as a nation we seem to come up with. But one can very quickly imagine that if we funded billions of dollars of worth of trauma healing, reconciliation work, violence prevention and de-escalation, unarmed protective accompaniment, robust diplomacy work, we would probably see much more rapid change in these conflicts. We've seen Russia and Ukraine spend 3 years fighting out this conflict violently. We can't roll
Yeah.
back the clock, but it's worth taking a moment just to recognize that if we had said, no, sit down for 3 years in a room together and work this out, that it probably wouldn't have taken them that much time. This was kind of the principle behind the Women of Liberia Mass Action for Peace when to stop the Second Liberian Civil War, when the rebel faction and the dictator Charles Taylor went to peace negotiations, the women came and demonstrated outside the building. And when the men were just kind of like stalling their feet and posturing and not coming to an agreement, they sat down in front of the door and they said, you are not leaving this room until you come out with a peace agreement. There will not food, not water. You don't get to like go back to your cushy hotel and watch television tonight. You had to stay here and work it out. And you know what? They did. And it led to the dictator stepping down. It led to democratic elections. It stopped the Liberian Civil War. It instituted a disarmament campaign and ultimately elected their first woman president. So we can approach our conflicts very differently in the world. And I think one of the things I've learned from studying nonviolence is that we can have a lot more trust and confidence in these practices, skills, and approaches. They are worth investing in, knowing about, being articulate about, and putting into the field in bolder and bolder ways than we've ever imagined.
Gosh, certainly true. And just recognizing, as you mentioned, their cost effectiveness so that there's less of an argument to be had by the whoever's signing the page and rubber stamping something. Oh, is it going to save me money? Yes, actually it is. Well, if you say so. Treating your employees better. Wow, your product gets better, you save money as a company. If that's the reason that you need to treat your workers well, fine, we have that reason too. As much data as we can collect, the
There's
better, I think.
a set of schools in Rhode Island, middle schools and elementary schools, that are part of the Nonviolence Schools Project. And what they do is they spend the first 2 weeks of every semester teaching Kingian nonviolence and conflict resolution skills. And when they first started doing this, the teachers were like, oh, we're going to fall so far behind in the mandated curriculums that we all have to deal with. What they found was that by the end of the school year, they were ahead in the curriculum because they didn't have as many disruptive conflicts coming up over and over and over again in the classroom. And when a conflict came up, the students already had sets of skills for working it out and dealing with it. So it didn't escalate to the point where it just threw everybody else in the class off as well. I know that there's also like a school in Detroit, Michigan that has trained every incoming freshman class for the past 5 years. So they just had their first fully trained high school of 1,000 kids who had learned violence de-escalation, active bystander skills, anti-bullying, conflict resolution, active listening. And you can just imagine what that would mean. No, it's not going to be a perfect utopia, but it does mean that when something kicks off in the hallway, all of your friends know something else to do besides saying fight, 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 right? So they can say, no, stop it, break it up, you guys, cool off, go cool off. And this is the kind of like shift in culture that I'm really interested in and interested in seeing at scale. It could be like completely transformative for our nation and for our world.
Absolutely. Especially each succeeding generation, if they teach their families, if they reach out to their friends and that becomes the norm, oh, we talk our way through it. We work through it in a way that actually leaves us closer rather than destroying the relationship. What an amazing
Yeah, and
transformation.
people often say that, change takes a long time, and sometimes it does, but other times it does not. I mean, we're both of an age where we probably remember the the time before emails. When I was in high school, my
Yeah,
family, all seven of us, had one email account together. So in my short 20 years since then, we've gone from one email to I think I have like five emails personally, several devices. We're streaming on Zoom, which was unheard of when I was in high school. So if we spent the next
yeah.
20 years teaching nonviolence at scale, at as large a scale as possible, to as many people as possible, in all its dimensions. Teaching nonviolence as a literacy campaign, the same way that we have tech literacy campaigns, um, investing in it, the way that we've invested in the explosion of the internet, not the dot-com bubble. We can skip that part. Then we can start to actually imagine a very different culture within our lifetimes. The time you and I are like gray-haired and rocking chairs. Oh, actually, in 20 years, I suspect that we're just about retirement age. Hold off on those rocking chairs for a couple of years.
One of the questions I had for you, because I'm, again, inspired by your storytelling and the concept that we are not just introducing other ways to see the world, but also reflections upon our own society. If you make an extreme difference, we go, oh, I recognize that that resonance, that echo in my own world around me. And it's not very far off, this painting that you were creating for us. And like, right now it's almost 100 years since the discovery of penicillin. And the way that it was isolated, as in this mold, is that by accident, someone was studying bacteria. We said, oh, we recognize this interesting bacteria. Let's put it in a petri dish, look at it. And because we isolated the fact that we had bacteria and that was something we wanted to treat, then almost by accident, when this little mold spore came in and they discovered, wow, this, kills off all the bacteria around it, then suddenly we had a way of treating it. And I recognize that often, again, in our culture in particular, violence isn't seen as a problem. It's part of the tool bag, it's part of the solutions. It's maybe the number one thing that we reach toward, the most effective thing to do, like kicking the TV when it's not working. And I recognize that maybe one of the first things that we need to do is to help the broader culture recognize that actually violence is part of the problem. And then we can look around and see that we've had this treatment all along, whether it's from bread mold or something else. And I'm wondering about how we can broaden awareness that not only do we have solutions, but first people have to recognize that there's a problem, so then they can look around and take the solution that's been growing all along. Do you have any ideas about how to?
Yeah, there's a great program called the Alternatives to Violence Project, which does a lot of this work that really helps people recognize a lot of people. I think a lot of people know that violence is a problem. What they are struggling with is this idea that it's also not a solution to that problem. Right. So a lot of people have direct experience with the pain of violence. Nobody likes it when they experience the violence being inflicted on them. But oftentimes, and this is a very old story in the US, in our world, and I want to talk about that in a second. We think, oh, the only solution is to arm up and be the bigger bully so that nobody bullies us anymore, right? That's literally how we're taught to deal with bullies. In Sweden, by the way, they have this tremendously successful program where if someone becomes a bully in the school and they're identified as such, they take that bully into a special program and they train that bully to then be the identifier and change maker of other bullies in the school. All right. So they
How
say,
wonderful.
we know now that bullying is often a sign that someone has been bullied by someone bigger or stronger or more empowered than them, usually an adult or an older brother or an older student. And then they in turn try to reclaim some of their power by bullying someone else. So this program helps them break that cycle and step out of that and see a different role for themselves that gives them a sense of agency and power to be a valued member of a community, to have a sense of capacity and ability to take on a certain role in a community, and break out of the pattern that they're in. I think that's a really smart program with very wide ranging metaphorical or symbolic applications to many of the things that we face today.
How fantastic. Gosh.
So I do want to mention
Wow.
this idea about violence being an old story. I serve as on the advisory board of World Beyond War, a great organization that's trying to abolish all war, just once and for all. This idea that there are no good wars, there are no wars to end war. The problem is war itself, and we need to dismantle the institution of it if we ever want to end this constant cycle of war that we're in. One of the things they really brought forward was the archaeological record on war. We think war has been around forever. It has not. The earliest known records of organized violence is only from 10,000 BC. Now that sounds like a really long time, 12,000 years. That's a while. But humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, have been around for like 300,000 years. You know what's older than war? Dogs as man's best friend. Domesticated dogs. Pottery, jewelry, religion, art, boats. sewing, weaving, and a whole host of other things. So I bring that up to say we can have rich and vibrant cultures without the use of violence. Violence is not inherent to who we are as human beings, particularly not organized violence on the scale of war. And so I like to consider that perhaps this will be a blip on our very long timeline. This period that we look back on and say, oh, those dark ages when we believed war was a solution. And
Yeah.
we are able as a species to move beyond it someday. That's kind of one of the visions I
Yeah,
want
that's
to
right.
be working towards in my lifetime. I don't think I'm going to get to it in this lifetime. I won't rule it out, but I do think it's a tall order for our societies, but it's a worthy one. Once upon a time, we could not imagine that women would have the right to vote or equal rights to men. We could not imagine that Black people in this country would not be enslaved in some form. We could not imagine that children wouldn't be working in fact 12-hour days in factories and instead be mandated to go to school, everyone, regardless of class. So we've already over and over again achieved things that were unimaginable only a few decades before.
Wow. You are a center of inspiration, I tell you. And again, it comes so often from the stories that we're told that I personally grew up in a culture and a worldview where you were born bad and you need to be saved from your badness. And since then, of course, I've studied a number of traditions, whether it's uh, Buddhism, the Taoist perspective, the Confucian, Mengzi, these places where they say, no, actually, it's the natural human condition to be to be kind, to be present. That any random person, unless there's something severely wrong with them, they see a small child tottering to a well, everybody's going to rush over, even another small child, and rescue them beforehand. It's in our nature. And then it's the stories that we tell, it's the conversations that we have, it's the structures we've created that begin to distort that way of being in the world. And so that restoration is a really big part of my own exploration and I see it within the stories you're telling, again, giving us a way back toward where we were before.
So yeah, if we look at that timeline of human history, storytelling undoubtedly preceded war. Undoubtedly. We can tell that from things like goddess statues, right? So what is faith and spirituality but a set of stories to explain who we are and why we're here. That you can have your faith and believe you have the one that story is true. You may others may believe a different story, but the we express our faith and explain the great mystery of it all through a story, whether that's Buddha or the Tao or Jesus. And so what I look at in the long arc of human history is that war co-opted the power of storytelling for its purposes, and war co-opted our great human values of protection, perseverance, determination, courage, all of which were expressed when, our ancestors, wherever we were around the globe, walked for miles to find water, or, really persevered when they were hunting for food, or our laboring mothers bringing us into the world, right? Anybody who is born of a mother, which is all of us, has experienced a human being who has wrestled with life and death, shown courage, perseverance, persistence, and all of those great values that we ascribe and attribute to warriors. So at some point, when as war became a thing, we started to use storytelling to reinforce it, to say that it's noble, it's honorable, it's just, we're going to honor our warriors. And we even get things like the Vikings, who I have some Viking ancestry. In their religion, only those who die in battle go to heaven, Valhalla, right? The happy hall where the warriors drink mead all day long and tell stories. Everybody else, if you don't die in battle, you go to like this this gray hell realm where it's cold and miserable and there is no mead. So, if you have a belief system like that, it means that you are going to try to die in battle, which means you better go pick some fights. Otherwise you're going to die of, I don't know, influenza or something, old age. Gosh. So, yeah, the worst thing you can
The
imagine.
worst thing I can imagine.
So, we have to be careful about the stories that we're telling and be aware of what they're training us to believe and perceive, and then what they're training us to live and do in our world.
Mm, mm. Yeah, and we so often look around as a culture for the stories that seem to reflect the ideas we already have. So we study the chimpanzees and we see them going to war and we say, oh, they're just like us. But we're studying other creatures, the bonobos or others, that are peaceful, matriarchal.
How did we get to that conclusion?
That's right. And so, gosh, and one thing that I'd like to ask you before I miss my chance. Not only do I like to begin with reasons for hope and inspiration, but as well I want to pick your brain as a seasoned activist and educator. The next steps for people, the place that you would, you meet somebody on the street and they want to know what to do next, the place that you know is really effective to look toward. What would you recommend to them?
If you do not already, get a meditation practice or a centering practice. If meditation is a little bit out there for you, find a quiet, still spot and let your mind settle. That's to me the foundation for dealing with the chaos that we find ourselves in. If we want to be able to respond to the authoritarianism that's on the rise, or the human rights abuses that we're seeing, or we want to show up for our community and take care of people amidst the economic impacts of what's going on, we need to have the ability to watch our minds and to come back to our center over and over and over again. Otherwise, we start running around like a chicken with our head cut off, and we are no help to anyone. So that's the first. And then find a place that pulls your heart and settle in there and do that bit of work. Because we can't run around like a chicken with our head on trying to do everything. That's not going to work either, right? So find your piece of the pie to take care of. Then go recruit 3 friends to do their piece of the pie, because we have enough people to meet the demands of the times. If you think about this in numbers, if it takes 3.5% of the populace to say, get rid of a dictator in power, or end an authoritarian regime, or, win human rights and civil rights, then we already know at the scale of our population that there is at least 7 times 11 million people out there who did not vote for this particular administration, probably do not support most of what's going on. But to get those 77 million people into action means that we need to invite them into action. And so, where do you find out about actions? I recommend reading Nonviolence News. I try to cover a lot of these stories. I also run a little program called Rise and Shine. It's resistance time, where I try to like distill what are the best places to plug in right now, so that you can find those. So we'll make sure that link goes in the chat box as well, or the yeah, below the thing.
Hello. Absolutely.
So that's some starters. I think those are some good general rule of thumbs to follow that will be perennial, and no matter what's rising, what's happening, what's occurring. I think we can, as nonviolent activists and people of conscience, reclaim, go reverse engineering some of the things about warriors that we've been talking about, that we've given the warrior mode all those values of courage, of presence, of showing up, of protection. We can reclaim those for ourselves as we move into nonviolent action, as we show up as groundedly and as centeredly as we can, as we stay human with one another. I think these are all can be taken out of the survival skill modes and put into this disciplined practice for ourselves in these times, knowing that these are times of intensity.
Hmm. Is there anything that in your many lectures and opportunities to talk to the public, is there anything
Mm.
that you wish we would ask you about?
I think the thing I will add to all of this storytelling that we've been doing, it's 100,000 years of history, and all current events, and this moment now. So the story of our times is one of the most extraordinary moments in human history. It is really difficult to live through. But if we are so lucky as a species to get to the other side of this, these times will be the stuff of legends. No joke. This is the most existential, mythic drama moment that we have ever encountered as human beings. Ever. It is existential on so many fronts. The odds are so stacked against us. As humans, we love stories like The Lord of the Rings, right? We just love that story because of its existential nature. The stakes are so high. We forget that we ourselves are mo largely like hobbits pulled off onto the road, kicking and screaming and wondering where our sixes and elevens are, and ducking orcs at every moment. So the experience of being in the story is largely unpleasant. Involves wet socks, involves scary orcs, that sort of thing. But in hindsight, we will know that we were part of the turning point in human history. If there are people alive to tell the story of these times, it will be because we rose to these times and won. And that's what makes it the most amazing moment to be human. So if you are feeling a little bit like Sam and Pippin and not Frodo, but the other ones on the road and a little bit reluctant about this process, just remember that there is a big vision of where we're going. We don't know if we're going to get there. That's what makes it such an alive moment. But I think Gandhi gave us this great phrase that is, uh, total commitment is total victory. Total effort is total victory. So letting go of having to know the outcome, letting go of having to know how it's all going to work out, and just give this moment your all and treat it like one of the most important moments in human history because you know what? It is. And we are lucky to be alive in these times to be able to turn the whole story of humanity around in this moment.
Rivera Sun, thank you so much. You are very loved and appreciated. And to everybody else, be kind, be connected, be unafraid.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much. I appreciate you.